The wind over Wyoming's plains had a sound that could hollow a soul. It swept through the sage and the brittle grass, dragging dust like memory, whispering names long forgotten. On such a wind came a woman in faded calico, her bonnet torn and her hands red with cold. Her name was Clara Mae Dawson, though she hadn't heard it spoken kindly in a long while. She had buried her husband 2 winters ago when the fever took him, and since then the world had grown heavier and quieter. The little cabin they had built in Montana had been sold for debt, and all she had left fit inside a small trunk strapped to the back of a half-starved mule. Each mile she walked south was another mile away from what she had been. A wife, a homemaker, a woman with laughter in her throat. What remained was someone else entirely. Tired eyes, cracked lips, and the stubborn will to keep breathing because something, maybe God, maybe pride, and wouldn't let her quit. It was near sundown when she first saw the ranch. It sprawled across the horizon like an island of life in a sea of loneliness. The fences were old but straight, the barn weathered but solid. A single horse stood near the gate, tail flicking, its coat the color of rust. Smoke curled from the chimney of a long, low house, and the scent of something cooking drifted faintly through the cold. Clara paused at the edge of the property, her heart thudding with a mix of fear and hunger. She had knocked on doors before and been turned away. A lone woman wasn't always welcome in these parts, not unless she came with something to trade. And all she had now were her hands and her courage. She hesitated until the wind bit her cheeks raw, then gathered her skirts and walked up to the porch. Her boots made soft sounds against the boards. The door opened before she could knock. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 40, with a face that looked carved from both kindness and grief. His eyes were pale, a washed-out blue like mountain ice, and they lingered on her with quiet caution. He said nothing at first. The silence between them stretched long enough for her to hear her own breath trembling. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said softly. I'm just looking for a place to earn my keep. I can cook, mend, tend stock if need be." Her voice wavered, then steadied. "I'm not worth much, sir, but I can cook." The man's jaw shifted as though her words stirred something he hadn't let move in a long while. He studied her worn shoes, the dirt on her skirt, the exhaustion behind her politeness. "You traveling alone?" he finally asked. She nodded. "Yes, sir." He looked past her at the mule tied by the fence, then back into the dim room behind him. "It's a hard road for a woman alone," he murmured. "You'd best come inside before the coyotes find your scent." Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the smell of stew. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the flicker of light touched the corners of a room both tidy and lonesome. She noticed the table set for one, the single chair by the fire, the coat hanging near the door that hadn't been worn in some time. Everything in that house seemed to breathe the presence of someone who wasn't there anymore. He poured her coffee without asking, and said, "Name's Eli Turner. Been running this ranch since my brother passed." His voice was low, rough from years of wind and work. "You can stay the night in the spare room. We'll talk come morning." Clara held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I'll earn my way, I swear it." He nodded once, not looking at her, and went back to tending the fire. For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the wind moaned through the cottonwoods. Inside, 2 strangers sat in the dim glow. A widow with nothing left but her pride, and a rancher with a secret that hung in the air like the scent of ash after rain. When she finally went to the small room he'd shown her, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked out through the frost-streaked window. She thought of her husband's grave, a mound beneath a pine tree somewhere far to the north, and of the way the preacher had said, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away." She had given all she had, and yet somehow the world still demanded more. But tonight she was warm. Tonight someone had opened a door instead of closing one. And though she didn't know it yet, the man who had taken her in carried wounds deeper than her own. Wounds carved by guilt and by love that had long since turned to silence. When the firelight dimmed, she whispered a small prayer, not for mercy, not for fortune, but simply that tomorrow might hold a reason to stay. The wind outside shifted, soft as breath, and the rancher's lonely silhouette passed by her door, pausing just long enough for her to wonder if he, too, was listening for the sound of forgiveness in the dark. Morning came soft and gray over the Turner ranch. Mist hung over the pasture like a veil, and the world seemed suspended between sleep and sorrow. Clara rose early. She always had, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The smell of coffee and cedar wood filled her lungs, and then memory came rushing back. The journey, the mule, the knock on the stranger's door. She dressed in silence, smoothing her faded dress, and stepped into the main room where Eli sat by the hearth with a ledger in his hand. The firelight drew lines of weariness across his face, and she noticed how still he was, as though his thoughts were heavier than his body could bear. "Good morning." "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice still hushed from sleep. "I took the liberty of starting the coffee earlier." He looked up briefly, nodded once. "Appreciate it. Most folks around here ain't up for dawn." "Old habits," she smiled faintly. "My husband liked his coffee early. Said the day didn't start till the beans cracked." At the mention of her husband, Eli's gaze drifted toward the window. "And he ain't with you now?" She shook her head gently. "Buried him near Dillon, up north. Fever took him sudden." She stirred the pot on the stove, not wanting him to see the ache that tightened her throat. "Since then I've been moving. Cooking for a bit here and there. Trying to keep busy. Busy hurts less." Eli didn't reply, but she sensed a softening in the air. Something about her words seemed to reach him. Maybe because he understood that kind of hurt all too well. He folded the ledger, rose, and said, "If you're willin', I could use a hand round here. Ain't had anyone keep the house since—" He trailed off, the sentence unfinished but heavy. "Board and wages enough to keep you fed." "I'd be grateful," Clara said simply. And so began her quiet work on the Turner Ranch. The days unfolded in rhythm, mending curtains, scrubbing floors, tending the garden that had nearly gone to dust. She fixed what was broken, polished what was forgotten, and cooked with a gentleness that seemed to stir life back into the place. Her biscuits came out golden and soft, her stew rich and hearty, and for the first time in years Eli began sitting at a table set for two. At first they ate mostly in silence. He'd nod his thanks. She'd smile faintly and clear the plates. But over the weeks, little by little, the silence grew less hollow. She'd hum while she worked, old hymns and tunes her mother once sang. And though Eli rarely spoke, he'd linger in the doorway to listen. One afternoon, when the sun was warm and high, she found him by the barn repairing a fence rail. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hands strong but slow as if every motion was weighed by thought. She brought him a tin cup of lemonade and said, "You work harder than most, Mr. Turner." He glanced at her, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Work's easier than thinking, Mrs. Dawson." She met his eyes for the first time in full light, eyes the color of faded skies, holding both gentleness and guilt. "Then maybe you've been thinking too much." He paused, hammer in hand, as though her words had struck something deep. "Maybe so," he murmured, looking past her toward the wide, empty plains. "World don't forget easy, Clara. Neither do folks like me." That was the first time he'd spoken her name, and she felt it like a touch, soft but lingering. From then on, something quiet bloomed between them. Not courtship, not even friendship at first, but a kind of understanding that didn't need words. In the evenings, they'd share supper by the fire, sometimes speaking of small things, the weather, the cattle, the shape of the moon. Other nights, they'd say nothing at all, just listen to the logs crack and the wind outside pressing against the walls. She never asked about the other room at the end of the hall, the one with the door always shut. But sometimes, when the night grew still, she'd hear Eli's steps stop there, as if he were listening to ghosts. One Sunday, after she baked bread and set the table, she found a small wooden box on the counter. Inside was a simple silver brooch in the shape of a star. The metal was worn, edges dulled, but it gleamed softly in the morning light. A note lay beneath it, written in a strong but uncertain hand. "For your kindness, E.T." She turned the brooch over in her palm, her heart swelling and aching all at once. It wasn't a gift of romance. It was gratitude, and maybe even atonement. She pinned it to her collar, and when Eli saw it that evening, his eyes lingered just a moment before he looked away, jaw tightening like a man fighting memory. That night, Clara sat by the window in her room, the brooch catching the moonlight. She thought of her husband, of the love they'd shared, steady and simple. And she thought of Eli, whose silence was not cold but careful, as though he feared what might come alive if he spoke too much. She didn't know yet what haunted him, but she knew it wasn't cruelty. No, Eli Turner was kind, the kind that hurt. the kind that carried guilt because it had loved once and lost harder than most men could bear. As the days shortened and autumn brushed the plains with gold, Clara began to feel something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. But beneath it ran an undercurrent of sorrow she couldn't name, like music played in a minor key. For all his quiet generosity, Eli still kept a distance, a wall of silence that her warmth couldn't quite climb. Sometimes when she caught him staring into the fire after supper, she'd see a look on his face, not longing but regret. And in her heart a small voice whispered that his secret, whatever it was, would one day break them both. Still, she stayed. Because even sorrow when shared can feel like home. The first frost of winter came early that year. It silvered the fields like spun glass, and when Clara looked out the window each morning, she could see her breath mingle with the mist. Life on the ranch had fallen into a quiet rhythm. She'd rise before dawn, light the stove, and start the day's bread. Eli would be out by sunrise, checking fences or feeding the horses, and by the time he returned, the smell of coffee would be waiting for him. It was a simple life. No laughter ringing through the walls, no children's feet on the porch, just two souls moving around each other like cautious stars in the same cold sky. Yet somehow the silence between them began to feel less lonely. One night a storm rolled over the plains. The wind howled, rain slashed against the shutters, and lightning split the sky open like a wound. Eli had gone out to secure the barn, leaving Clara by the fire with worry clawing at her chest. When he returned soaked to the bone, she rushed to hand him a towel, scolding without thinking. "You'll catch your death going out in that weather," she said, hands trembling as she brushed rain from his coat. He chuckled softly, the first real laugh she'd ever heard from him. "Wouldn't be the worst thing," he murmured. "Don't say that." Her voice broke sharper than she meant. "Don't talk like you ain't worth the breath God gave you." He froze then, eyes locked on hers. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm outside and the fire crackling low. "Clara," he said at last, voice raw. "There's things about me you don't know. Things that'd make you take those words back." She shook her head gently. "Then tell me." He hesitated, then turned away. "Not tonight." He left, her standing by the fire, her heart thudding with a strange, aching worry. Not fear, not judgment, but the sorrow of sensing a wound she couldn't reach. Days passed, and the storm gave way to snow. The world turned white, and in that hush of winter the ranch seemed to shrink into itself. Clara often caught Eli standing by the window at night, staring toward the barn. Once, she saw him carry a small bundle from the house, a faded shawl perhaps, or a blanket, and disappear into the dark. When he came back, his shoulders were shaking, though whether from cold or tears she couldn't tell. Curiosity warred with compassion in her chest. She wanted to ask, but she also feared breaking the delicate peace between them. Still, one afternoon, when he'd ridden out to check the southern fence, she found herself standing before the door at the end of the hall, the one that always stayed closed. Her hand hovered over the knob, trembling. "Forgive me," she whispered and turned it. The room inside was dim and still. Dust motes danced in the pale light spilling through the curtains. There was a bed, small, neatly made, and beside it, a cradle. The sight stopped her breath. A child's wooden blocks lay scattered near the wall, and on the dresser sat a single photograph, a woman with bright eyes and a baby in her arms. The woman's smile was soft, alive, and heartbreakingly familiar in a way Clara couldn't explain. Beneath the photo lay a pressed flower, a violet, faded to gray. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Suddenly, she understood the silence, the way Eli's eyes had always seemed to be watching something far away. This was the room he kept untouched, a shrine to the life he'd lost. She didn't need to know how. The grief in that room was a language she already spoke. When Eli returned that evening, she was by the fire again, sewing quietly. He paused in the doorway, snow-dusting his hat, his expression unreadable. "You went in there," he said softly. She lowered her needle, unable to lie. "Yes, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, but I needed to understand what pain keeps you chained to ghosts." He set his gloves down, jaw tight. That was my wife, Lila, and our little girl, Annie. Fever took the both of them 3 winters ago. I buried him behind the hill. Thought maybe if I kept the room as it was, I'd hear him again. Smell her bread. Hear the baby cry. His voice cracked. But there's just silence. That's all that's left of a man who couldn't save his own family. Clara's eyes stung with tears. You can't keep punishing yourself for what you couldn't change, Eli. He laughed bitterly. Can't I? I wasn't there, Clara. I was riding for supplies when the fever took hold. By the time I came back, the preacher was waiting with 2 graves dug. You tell me how a man forgives himself for that. She rose, stepping closer, her voice trembling. By learning to live again. By letting someone else care for you when you can't. You gave me shelter when I had none. Let me give you a little peace in return. He looked at her then, really looked. And for a moment, the hard shell of grief cracked. He reached out, brushed a tear from her cheek with a touch that lingered longer than it should have. You remind me of her, he whispered. Not in looks, in spirit. Strong when the world breaks you. Clara's heart fluttered painfully. Maybe that's why God sent me here. The firelight flickered between them, their shadows merging on the wall. And though neither spoke again, something passed in that silence. Not love exactly, but the fragile beginning of it, born from shared sorrow and the desperate need to believe that broken hearts could still beat side by side. That night, Eli didn't stop by the closed door. Instead, he stood in the hallway outside Clara's room for a long while, listening to the faint rhythm of her breath through the wood. It was the first time in years he'd felt the ache of wanting to live again, and the first time Clara realized that healing another's heart sometimes meant risking your own. Winter on the plains could swallow a soul whole. The snow came down in heavy drifts, muffling the sound of life until even the cattle seemed like ghosts moving across the white. For weeks, the wind howled across the Turner Ranch, rattling the windows and piling frost on the glass. But inside the little house, something gentle had begun to bloom. Clara cooked, mended, hummed softly, and filled the rooms with small human warmth. Eli worked through the bitter days, shoulders bent, his silence less cold now, more thoughtful, more alive. The ranch, once a tomb for memory, began to breathe again. They fell into the kind of closeness that grows quietly without words or promise. When she'd burn her hand on the stove, he'd be there before she could cry out, taking her wrist gently, wrapping the burn with a strip of cloth. When his back ached from hauling feed, she'd brew him willow tea and scold him in that soft, mothering tone that made him smile despite himself. And sometimes, when the night was too still, they'd sit by the fire together, the air between them thick with things neither dared to say. One evening, after a long day of fixing a broken fence in the snow, Eli came in with frost clinging to his beard. "You'll freeze yourself to the bone," Clara said, rushing to help him pull off his coat. He smiled faintly. "You worry too much, Clara May." "Somebody has to," she replied, taking his gloves from his hands. "A man like you'd sooner die of stubbornness than cold." He laughed, a deep, low sound that surprised even him. "You sound like Lila sometimes," he said softly, and instantly his smile faded. Clara froze, then reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "It's all right," she whispered. "You don't have to hide her from me. I ain't jealous of the dead." Eli looked down at her, eyes heavy with emotion he could no longer hold back. "You're kind, Clara, too kind. I don't deserve it." "Maybe not," she said, voice trembling. "But maybe I do. Maybe I deserve to care for someone again." He stared at her for a long moment, the firelight painting gold on the lines of his face. Then, as if pulled by a force older than grief, he took her hand and pressed it to his chest. His heart was strong beneath her fingers, steady and alive. "You saved this place," he murmured. "You saved me." Her eyes filled, and before she could speak, he leaned forward, brushing his lips softly against her forehead. It wasn't a lover's kiss, it was something gentler, holier. The kind that said thank you and I'm sorry all at once. When he stepped back, there was silence, but it was the kind that didn't hurt anymore. From that night on, their world shifted. Clara began to hum as she worked, her voice light like spring wind. Eli started carving again, something he hadn't done since Lila died. He'd sit by the fire after supper, whittling bits of cedar into small figures: a horse, a bird, a child's doll. One morning he handed her one of those carvings, a little angel with her hands folded in prayer. "For your kindness," he said. She smiled through tears. "Then I'll keep her where I can see her," reminding me that even angels fall into the snow sometimes. But the cold was cruel that winter. The snow kept coming, trapping them on the ranch. Supplies ran low, and Eli pushed himself harder than ever, hauling hay through blizzards, breaking ice at the creek for the cattle. Clara begged him to rest, but he only smiled that weary, gentle smile. "Cattle don't wait, Clara. They depend on me." One morning he came in coughing, his face pale, his breath ragged. "Just the cold air," he said. But by nightfall his fever had taken hold. Clara sat by his bed, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead, whispering prayers through trembling lips. "Don't you leave me, Eli Turner," she whispered into the dark. "Not when I just found reason to live again." He stirred weakly, his hand finding hers. "I ain't going anywhere," he rasped. "You're stuck with me yet." But the look in his eyes told her he was lying. She could see it. The same ghostly shadow she'd seen on her husband's face before he'd gone cold in her arms. For 3 days she nursed him, refusing to sleep. She brewed herbs, fed him broth, and spoke softly even when he didn't answer. "You listen to me, Eli," she whispered one night, voice breaking. "You think you don't deserve to live, but you do. You do. Because you opened your door to a broken woman and gave her a home. You showed me kindness when I'd near forgotten what it felt like. So you fight. You hear me? You fight." Outside, the wind moaned like a morning song, but inside her words carried warmth, fighting the chill that had claimed too many souls already. And for a while, it seemed he might make it. His fever broke on the 4th day. His breathing steadied, and when he finally opened his eyes, he found her head resting on his arm, asleep at last. "Clara May," he whispered weakly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're my reason, you know that?" She stirred, blinking up at him through tears. "Then live for me, Eli, just live." He smiled faintly. "I'll try." But deep down, Clara knew. Love had come too late to save him. The cold had already taken root in his lungs, and no prayer, no kindness could undo what winter had begun. The days that followed blurred together, pale and silent like the sky after a storm. Eli's fever had eased, but his strength never returned. He was up for an hour each morning, then spent the rest of the day by the fire, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. Clara did everything: tended the animals, chopped wood, cooked what little food remained. She never complained, never cried where he could see. When she smiled at him, it was soft and steady, the way a lamp burns low but refuses to go out. By late February, the cold had grown cruel again. Frost crept inside the windows, and the snow outside piled so high it buried the fence posts. The world seemed made of silence. One night, as Clara brought Eli his supper, she noticed a deep flush on his cheeks and the rasp of air in his lungs. He tried to wave her worry away. "I'll be fine," he said, coughing between words. "It's just the cold hanging on." But she knew better. She'd seen that same look before, on her husband's face when the fever had burned too long and too hard. She reached out, brushing damp hair from Eli's forehead. "Don't you lie to me," she whispered. "You promised you'd fight." He smiled faintly. "And I have, Clara May. But some fights ain't meant to be won. Some are just meant to be shared." Her throat ached. "Then we'll share this one together." That night she sat beside him as the wind howled outside. He drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring half-formed words. Names, memories, pieces of prayers. Once he whispered Lila, and Clara felt tears sting her eyes. But then, softer still, came Clara May. "Thank you, don't thank me," she said, voice trembling. "Just stay." He smiled faintly in his sleep. "You made this place warm again." The next morning she woke with a cough of her own, low, dry, but sharp enough to make her chest ache. She ignored it at first, hiding it behind her sleeve when Eli was awake. But as days passed, it deepened. The cold had seeped into her lungs, and though she'd spent her life nursing others, she had no one to nurse her now. Still, she refused to rest. She cooked, cleaned, tended to him with quiet determination, even when her hands shook and her breath came short. "Clara," Eli said one evening, his voice weak, "you're wearing yourself thin for an old fool." She smiled, sitting beside him. "You hush now. I told you once I ain't worth much, but I can cook, and I keep my word." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. She steadied him, her hand warm against his chest. "Don't you see?" she whispered. "We were both just waiting to be needed again." When spring finally came, it came late. The snow melted slow, turning the fields to rivers of mud. The first crocus bloomed near the porch, small and defiant against the chill. But inside the house, the air still carried the hush of winter. Eli's strength faded faster than the snow. One evening, he asked her to open the window just a crack to feel the wind. The air smelled of thawing earth and rain. "Hear that?" he murmured.
"Spring's coming," she nodded, though her own breath was shallow now.
"Yes, it is." "Clara May," he whispered, reaching for her hand. "I used to think the Lord was punishing me, taking Lila and Annie, but maybe he was just waiting to send me someone who'd remind me how to love him right in my heart again." Her tears fell freely now. "Don't you go talking like that," he smiled faintly. "Promise me one thing. When I'm gone, you'll keep the ranch. You'll stay." She squeezed his hand. "We'll stay," she said softly. That night the fire burned low. Eli drifted into a quiet sleep, his breathing slow and even. Clara sat beside him, humming an old hymn her mother used to sing, the one about crossing the river to the golden shore. Her own body ached with fever, her skin pale as moonlight. As the hours slipped by, her eyelids grew heavy. She laid her head beside his on the pillow, her hand still in his. When the morning sun rose over the plains, it found them like that, two figures beneath the quilt, hands clasped, faces turned toward each other, a faint smile on both their lips. The fire had gone cold, but the room was filled with a stillness too peaceful to be sorrow. Later that spring, a ranch hand riding in from town found the house quiet, the coffee pot cold. He buried them side by side beneath the cottonwoods on the hill behind the barn, near the graves of Lila and Annie. The grass grew green there first that year, and wild violets bloomed along the fence line. Folks in town still spoke of Eli Turner sometimes, the man who'd lost everything and still opened his door to a stranger. And of the widow who'd come with nothing but a kind heart and a promise to cook. No one knew the whole of their story. But when the wind swept across the Turner place in spring, carrying the scent of lilac and rain, it was said you could almost hear a woman's voice in it, soft and tender sound whispering, "I'm not worth much, sir, but I can love." And in that whisper, somewhere between heaven and the open plains, their hearts kept beating, together, always beneath the snow.